is it about APIs that you want to know? You can throw your response into the chat. In previous workshops, folks were very open and they said that they would like to know what an API even is, and that's a fair question. So please let me know in the chat what you're curious about with regard to APIs. How do I make one? It's a great one. How do they work? What are APIs? Nice. So hopefully we'll be addressing all of that today, because today is a fundamentals basics session basically on APIs. So let me actually jump in. I do want to share that I am so excited to be hosting this workshop for you all. And again, we'll be looking at absolute basics when it comes to APIs, so no prior knowledge about APIs is actually needed for this session. While we're here, if things feel a little bit flaky today, don't worry about it. You can always take our Postman Student Expert training at your own pace and for free anytime. But if you do have questions for me today, throw those into the chat as they start coming to mind. I'm kind of planning on jumping into the questions right after this session, so please don't shy away from asking. I'm here as a resource for you all, and you can also connect with anyone at Postman through our Discord community. You'll see a link for that and a QR code for that at the end of the presentation. I do want to give you a quick heads up that I will have questions for you throughout today's workshop, and you can share responses to my questions in the chat, just like you had earlier, as we go along. And then the last thing before I take it away from this slide, there will be a social media challenge for those folks who are paying very close attention today. Winners of the challenge will get to choose their own swag from the Postman swag store. So if you want to grab a notebook and a pen or take some screenshots, go for it. I'll share details about that later in today's presentation. Sweet, so I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Ruby. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a senior developer advocate at Postman, which is a platform that millions of folks are using to work with APIs. I haven't always actually been in the tech space though. I was previously an elementary and early ed school teacher. A series of very fortunate events, supportive people, and the choice to graduate from a coding bootcamp, plus a whole lot of hard work, of course, led me to where I am, which for the most part has involved continuing to find ways to spread knowledge. So here's a snapshot of what we will be covering today. By the end of the session, you should be able to explain why API education is important, explain what goes on with APIs behind the scenes, so how servers and clients relate to one another, how to make API requests yourself and analyze their responses, and then we'll have a follow-along portion so that you can test out an API in Postman. To do that, you're going to need to sign up for a free Postman account if you haven't already. And you don't need to download the desktop app, but you're free to do that if you want. The browser agent of Postman will work just fine for our purposes today. If you choose not to follow along, that's all right too. It looks like the session's being recorded, so you can choose to follow along later and maybe just watch for now. But like I mentioned earlier, I'm also going to do my best to carve out some space for Q&A at the end of the session, so please hold on to your questions or throw them into the chat. Awesome. And let's kind of take a look at the background of API education and where Postman student programs kind of fits in there. So to illustrate why API education is, all caps, a big deal, I've added a GIF here from a powerful and meme-worthy moment in history when Steve Ballmer from Microsoft was playing up the importance of developers. You can see him working up quite a sweat, just yelling, developers, developers, developers. This is a very noteworthy moment in history. I added it because, for the most part, developers are the ones who care a lot about APIs, but they're certainly not the only ones who should. I've also linked some study findings in here in which survey respondents were all actually API users. What the study reveals is that lots of different roles actually benefit from the standardized data access provided by APIs. So you got folks in management caring about APIs, solutions architects, business and data analysts, educators, researchers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone's using APIs in some way. Most professionals are going to need access to real data at some point in their careers. Whether they know it or not, they will be tapping into APIs to accomplish a lot of that. And Postman makes it easy to speed up those API interactions. So what exactly is Postman? Because of Postman's helpful features around APIs, the tool has become an industry standard used by lots of top companies, as you can see here and on the poster behind me, although that might be a little bit blurry for my little Zoom box. But we have folks like Salesforce as customers. What else do we have back here? We have Fox, all kinds of big names that you might recognize, as well as the ones on this slide. Plus, obviously, individual developers are using the free Postman tier every day. If you're learning about Postman, you're already ahead of the curve because employers at most companies are looking for folks who can easily use and understand developer tools like Postman. There's over 20 million folks already using Postman, so chances are pretty high that you're going to need to interact with it at some point on your journey as you work alongside tech professionals. So we will be diving into the nitty-gritty of what APIs are and how you can use one to supercharge your applications. But as a heads up, a lot of what we will be discussing is covered in detail in Postman Student Expert training. That training is self-paced, hands-on, and free. And it's something you can always revisit as much as you need to. Plus, you get a cool certificate and a badge when you complete the training, which you can throw onto your social profiles, and that might come in handy as you start applying for tech jobs if you haven't already. I can't emphasize enough that that training is going to set you up for success when you're using APIs. So here's that million-dollar question, and I know some folks in the chat were wondering about this. What is an API? Before I tell you anything else, here is a quick pulse check. Which of these services do you think involves APIs? Is it A, an application's login and sign-up flow where you can use authentication from another source? Is it B, adding songs to a playlist in an application like Spotify? C, closing out your online shopping cart on a website? Or D, receiving a text message confirmation from a website? Wow, we got a lot of folks saying all of the above, I'm assuming, everything. Ooh, we got somebody saying D, all of these. All right, well, this was an unfair trick question. The truth is that APIs really are everywhere. They are responsible for allowing code in one corner of the internet to talk to code in another corner. Nice job. So what is an API? API stands for Application Programming Interface. APIs are considered to be the building blocks of modern software. Like we said before, APIs allow code to talk to code. You can picture an API as a contract or an agreement between code sources. APIs are what let Cindy Lou's homemade weather app use information stored on some server containing weather data. That real data is exposed through an API, a contract, that Cindy follows in her application in order to collect the information that she needs. Sometimes, like Cindy, we need to get data from a service like Google, Facebook, Twitter. Those are just some examples. But since we don't have access to those companies' code bases, they create APIs so that developers can get information from their services without accessing the code base. Both developers and non-developers are using APIs to get data from popular services that they can then use in their own projects. So here is an API in action I'm about to show you. I will show you a Postman collection containing different related requests. One request will be using a messaging API to send myself a message about something. I won't dive into the inner workings of that API. I'm just using it as an example to show you how quickly and easily you can use Postman to get access to that kind of data through an API. Later on, I promise we will get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on. So let me switch over to Postman here. So if you just signed in, you would see something similar to this page. You don't have to follow along for this portion. I'm just going to show you for now. I have a public demo workspace called EducateHacks Demo Workspace. And since it's public, that means if you go to the search bar in Postman, you should be able to find it too and check out what I'm looking at. So I'm going to go into this workspace and I have a couple of collections, and each collection has a bunch of related requests within it. I'm actually going to go down to the Twilio messaging SMS collection, and that will be using Twilio's API. So what I've done as a background here, excuse me, I've gone to Twilio's developer portal. And what I've done there at developer.twilio.com, or wherever they host their developer portal. I've set up an account with them. I let them know I'm going to be working on a software project. I gave them the details about it. They trusted me and they gave me credentials to be able to use their API. And those credentials I've saved up here in an environment called Twilio Creds. So now that I have all those credentials to be able to use Twilio's API, I can use any request within this collection. So I'm going to open up the collection and there's a folder called Getting Started. Let me actually close this out because that's distracting. In this collection, I have a folder called Getting Started, and I have a request called Send an SMS, which is a post request. If I select that, here's the request world for this particular type of request. Looks like in the params tab, my parameters included an account SID, which is resolved now because I collected that from Twilio. I needed some authentication to be able to send this request. And I needed these to be resolved from Twilio's developer portal as well. I also need a body to be able to send this post request. So in that body, I need a phone number that will be receiving a message. And this had to be verified on Twilio's developer portal. And then Twilio itself gives you a phone number you can use as the sender. This also, of course, came from their developer portal. So just as a background, this phone number is not my actual phone number. If you stumble upon it for any reason, this is a fake Google Voice phone number. And that Google Voice information is here in this tab. You can see I have a bunch of test messages I've sent to myself in the past and in previous workshops. The last request was today, and it says test in all caps. So I need to send that phone number another message. Twilio's API is pretty handy for people like health clinics that send automated messages to you to remind you about your appointments and things like that. Folks who are sending mass messages, companies who are sending mass messages, they use Twilio's API more often than not. So I'm going to try to send myself a message, and it'll say, take notes for the swag challenge. Let's see if after I have resolved all my variables, and my request is all set up according to their documentation. If I send this, let's see if it works. So down here in response world, you can see I have a 200 level status code, which must mean it's a success. I have a response body, and this is letting me know everything that was sent over from the server. Looks like I'm very zoomed in, so you can't see all the tabs that you must be seeing. I also have headers and all this other stuff that was sent with my response. Cool, so I think it was successful. Let me check Google Voice over here. Yep, there's my latest message. Take notes for the swag challenge. Awesome. So that was really fast. On the surface, we just saw me sending a message to myself, but there was quite a bit of action going on under the hood there. To have been able to get that message, I needed to access Twilio's API, and I was able to access it by following its contract, which is all documented in their docs or API documentation online. But what's the real 1-2 step here on a very high level? We can imagine APIs as data liaisons through an analogy. So let's think of an API as a waiter at a restaurant. Imagine you go to your favorite restaurant and you order some food. So for me right now, it's this Italian restaurant that's down the road. They have excellent pasta and they always have like the freshest bread right when you sit down. It's amazing. But when I go to that restaurant, I'm the client at that restaurant in the front. I would be sending my requests through the waiter who tells the kitchen what to make. The staff in the kitchen process my order or my request. They gather any ingredients needed and prepare everything according to specifications. The waiter then finally comes back with my food, or they might tell me that the kitchen is out of what I ordered, or maybe some other mishap happened in the kitchen, but they're responsible for letting me know. Regardless, the waiter serves as a liaison between me and the kitchen, so that me in the front of the restaurant never has to know what's going on in the back. And that's kind of what APIs do for clients and services. Let's say you're a client, in this case, probably using a browser to go to some website. If you're participating in the swag challenge that I'll talk about more at the end of the presentation, to participate, you're going to need to create a tweet. To do that on Twitter's servers, you would be making an HTTP post request through Twitter's API. If you want to check out all the tweets with the Postman student hashtag or the EducateHacks hashtag, then you would make a GET request through Twitter's API with some parameters for those hashtags. So you can start to see how you can't really interact with websites or applications without the help of an API. The API is what handles your requests when you interact with a website or an application. The API is not something physical or visible. It exists as just a simplified concept, like a waiter written in code somewhere that the user cannot see. It'll reach out to where the data that you want lives on a server. Here is some terminology that you will come across in conversations and in documentation about APIs. So it's helpful to get to know what these words mean. The client in our restaurant was you, perhaps, walking in and making an order. The client is the agent that makes a request. A client could be a browser or an application that you've coded. It could even be your command line on your computer. It's the thing that's making a request to a server. If I'm using Postman to make requests, Postman would be the client because it's the thing that's allowing me to make requests and view responses from servers. A server controls resources and services. The API is the interface that exposes these resources and services to clients over a network like the public internet. Requests and responses are like a call and response that are sent over the network to between a client and a server. So that's all great information about how clients and servers relate to one another and what the request response pattern is. But what exactly goes into a request and what exactly goes into a response? Before we dive into that, I mentioned some apps and services that have APIs we've all probably used. And hopefully we're understanding that APIs are all over the digital world. Can you think of some APIs that you've come across in your day-to-day? So what are some examples of APIs that you have come across that you can think of? ChatGPT. Fun fact, we have an OpenAI collection in Postman if you wanted to play around with that even more. Stripe, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Google, they have their own APIs. That's a fact. Awesome. So I've definitely used like my Google login to sign into a bunch of random applications. Those applications used Google's API to allow that kind of authentication to happen. Maybe you've used Stripe's payment processing API to buy like the latest Jordans online. There's a ton of possibilities there. Shopify, PayPal, Google Maps, that's another popular one. Yeah, definitely. That's in a lot of delivery apps for sure. So now that we've talked about what an API is, let's talk about requesting and receiving data with one. Here is what you would find in a request. We'll get a chance to look at what goes into a response pretty soon, but let's first focus on requests, the thing that a client first shares with an API. The first one here is methods. When you see them, they look a lot like verbs. They describe what an API is going to do with your request. The endpoint or path defines where the API should do those actions. Those two parts of the anatomy are the bare minimum needed to send a request. The others are going to be necessary based on your use case and how detailed you need to be when sending your request. And we'll take a closer look at those other parts pretty soon. But first, checking out methods and endpoints. When we make a request to an API, we have to specify what we want to get out of the interaction. We can use HTTP methods to do that. Methods let the client know which action to use for the URL. So remember, the client could be anything that you're using to make requests, like curl on your command line, an app that you've developed, your browser, Postman. And there's a lot of methods out there. The ones that you would probably see most often are get, post, put, and delete. These correlate or map to operations like CRUD, which stands for create, read, update, or edit, and delete. You might have heard of that already in your studies. If you think about a social media app where a user can select and view a profile, that user is making a GET request to retrieve that information, to get that profile or read it. An API goes ahead and delivers your request to the server where that data lives and returns the response, which is hopefully exactly what the user requested, a profile. When you try to add new tweets on your tweet timeline, for example, you're attempting a post request. It's even called posting a tweet, right? You're creating some new data on Twitter's data servers. If you were trying to delete tweets from the servers, you'd be attempting a delete request. Of course, publicly accessible APIs will require you to be authorized and authenticated to make certain kinds of requests. But let's talk about put and patch for a moment, because those are two different methods, but they share a definition in this table. Patch is for updating partial data on a record while keeping other data. You'll see what records look like during the demo at the end of this presentation, and it'll be more obvious the difference between put and patch when we get to that point. But put requests are designed to completely overwrite all data for a record. Patch is only partial data on a record. In addition to a method, an API request requires an endpoint. An endpoint includes a root URL or a base URL with a path. So you can see here, this google.com/search is broken up into the protocol, which is the Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure in this case. And then you have www.google.com. That's the nickname for the server, the host there. And then you have /search, which is the path or the hallway on the server that you need to go for your request that you're making. So let's take a look at parameters, another part of requests. When you make an API call with a GET method, you will usually retrieve everything from that URL address, and that can be pretty overwhelming. Parameters specify or zoom into the response data so that you can get only the specific information you're looking for. And parameters are not always going to be needed in every request. You can always confirm what's needed for a request to an API by reading that API's documentation. So you can see here that there are query and path parameters, and they each have unique qualities about them that are visible in the URL. Query parameters always start with a question mark, and a series of query parameters is separated by an ampersand symbol, so that little and symbol. Path parameters come directly after a /, and usually hold information like IDs. So let me show you how Google uses query parameters, and then I'll show you how Spotify uses path parameters. I see a quick question here. The slide deck has actually been shared with your organizer, so you will have access to this later if they have a place for them to share it. But let me jump back into this. Google using query parameters and Spotify using path parameters. So going into Google first, let me add a new tab here. I'm going to go to google.com. And what I want you to really pay close attention to is this URL up here. Right now, it's pretty basic, like you had seen in the example earlier. It's just google.com. We're just at the host. But what if I was searching for dogs? Now, all of a sudden, I have cute photos of dogs, but I also have this incredibly long URL. If I take this URL and I plug it into Postman, let me get out of all of this stuff here. Looking back at my collections, I have a dummy collection here that has nothing going on in it. It's actually just made for this example. There's an empty GET request in there. I'm going to paste that URL in here. And as soon as I pasted it, Postman was smart enough to realize that there were a bunch of query parameters in here. It saw that question mark and it saw all the ampersand symbols separating the query parameters, and it put them in a visual way here so that I can toggle them on and off if I don't need them. So if I toggle all of these off, which is pretty handy if I'm testing an API, for example, and I send it again, I still get the same, just in this example, the same HTML that's rendered on Google's homepage. So if I actually went into DevTools here and to inspect. All of this HTML is what's being rendered on this page. And that's also what I'm seeing in my response data in Postman. Let me minimize this so it's out of the way. I could also preview this in a similar way to my browser within Postman, which is quite handy. It looks like the images are not being fully rendered. That might be actually what the other query parameters were meant for. So that's pretty handy. But for now, that's just query parameters. So in my params tab of my request, these are just query parameters. Let's see what path parameters look like. Like we mentioned earlier, path parameters come after a / and they usually hold something like an ID. So going back into Postman, if I go into my Spotify collection, let me minimize this and actually close this first. I also have Spotify credentials. So similar to Twilio, I went to Spotify's developer portal, got those credentials, saved them in an environment variable or an environment scope. All those variables are in there. I'm going to actually see if I can get a user's playlists. So if I open this request, you can see that I have a root URL. In Postman, I've used a variable because it's just a lot easier if you're using the same thing 100 times to use variables. I've saved that variable in my collection, but that's the root URL. It's at the /v1/users path. So maybe in one hallway down another corridor or something. Here is the user ID, which is actually my path parameter. In Postman, if you use a colon ahead of something like this, it automatically assumes this is going to be a path parameter. I could have also just hard-coded this ID right into the URL, and it would have been the same thing. But that's essentially what a path parameter looks like. It usually holds stuff like an ID. In this case, it needed a user ID for this request. So if I send this, I should see a user's playlists. So for that particular user, this is all their playlists. That's me right there. And these are my playlists, which aren't that many. I think I just have one playlist actually. But that's pretty neat that you can toggle path parameters and query parameters in this way in Postman. Great, so that's path parameters. We also saw query parameters. Another part of requests is headers. A request can include headers that provide additional metadata about the request to the server. Metadata is data about data, not just data about Facebook, which is very confusing for a name. But metadata is data about data. Basically, headers can be thought of as the information that you might see on the outside of an envelope. There's still a message inside of the envelope, but the outside of the envelope might tell you information about what you're finding inside. So for example, a return address or a fragile label. Headers are important for authorization. They allow clients to access protected resources from an API. In fact, it's actually common practice to send some authorization data like access tokens in the header. Twitter's API is going to require authorization, for example, because if it didn't, anyone using the API could post on my behalf or maybe even search private user information, which would not be ideal. Folks who are using healthcare applications and are using an API for that, they might go in and add new information that's not factual or true. So that is dangerous territory, and that requires authorization to be able to access that kind of data. And that authorization would then go into a place like a header. If you can't remember what each of these headers are, don't worry, you can hover over tooltips in Postman to learn more about them at any time. So in Postman, for that request we just looked at in Spotify, Request World has a headers tab. Remember, headers are holding metadata, data about data. So this is data about our request. Where was the host that this request came from? What was the connection like? What was the content type? It was an application JSON. This is data about our request, data about our data. And then heads up, your response also has metadata in your headers tab here. So you get stuff like date. When did you get that response? That's data about your data. Cool. Requests also have something called a body. When you're interacting with a website or an application, you're not just going to be retrieving information or making GET requests, There's going to be times when you need to add or change data that you find in an application. We talked earlier about other HTTP methods like post, put, and patch. For these methods to be used, your API is going to expect you to send something new with your request. This is going to be sent through a request body. A body could also be sent to the client by the server in a response. You'll often see the body in JSON format, and that stands for JavaScript Object Notation. But it's not necessarily JavaScript. It's just an easy way to organize data in a readable format. So taking a look at all of these data types, you also, more often than not, are going to be seeing JSON. So in that last request we just looked at, our body came in JSON format. So that's just the syntax and the format that our information was in. You get all kinds of other formats for receiving your information here. Cool. So another quick pulse check. We just went over the anatomy of a request. What is the bare minimum needed to send a request? Let's see who remembers. The bare minimum needed to send a request. Requests have a lot of different parts to them, but what is the bare minimum needed to send a request? Path, method, type, method and path. Parameters might be confusing. So remember, parameters are use case based, right? And based on the documentation, if you need it for that particular request to get some specific information, you will need parameters. But the bare minimum is methods and endpoints with a path, right? So that's the bare minimum, methods and endpoints. Awesome. So when you send an API call or request, you will receive a response. There's a lot of great information that you get back in the response body, like status codes, response headers, and that response body. We also see things like latency, which if you're in quality assurance, QA, or otherwise just testing out an API, that could be pretty helpful information to track your API's performance. So looking at that last request that we just sent and the response here, in response world, let me minimize this. You have all these different parts, a lot of great information. So you have your response body, you have headers, you have a status code, you have latency information, which means how long did different parts of the response take to get to you. If you're designing the API to be hyper efficient, maybe this is important information to you. You want to make sure certain parts are not taking too long. What was the size of the response that you got? So different parts of the response, how big were they? Lots of great information here in response world. APIs return status codes with every single response. 200 OK means successful. There's lots of other common examples like 400 bad request, 401 unauthorized, 404 not found. You've probably seen a 404 error before. If I mistype the URL for a website like rudy.com instead of ruby.com, I might get a 404 status code and an error message if no such website exists. If you take one thing away from this slide, just know that all 200s are success codes. 300s are redirects, meaning you tried to do something somewhere that actually needed to be done somewhere else. 400s are client-side errors, so that is on us as the client, right, making the request. Maybe we got a 401 unauthorized. That means that we possibly used the wrong authorization information. Maybe our password was incorrect. Maybe we needed an auth token that we didn't enter. 500s are server-side errors. So that is an error occurring on the server, of course. So in the case of, let's say, a DOS attack, like a denial of service attack, you'll often see a 500 level error. This usually happens because of poor rate controls that are set for that server. Again, you don't have to memorize these as well. Postman explains the codes to you. And if that's not enough, you can always use status cats. Yes, status cats. I've added a link to the deck here, which you can catch later, but status cats are just a series of memes of cats helping you understand each of your status codes. If you're designing an API's error codes, that could be pretty handy for you to quickly figure out what each of those mean and design your error messages around those. Awesome. So I've done a lot of talking so far. It's time for us to get our hands dirty and test out an API for ourselves. We saw some APIs in action earlier, but let's actually try all of the CRUD actions available to us in another API. So this is a hint for you. This is the follow along portion. If you want to dive in with me, you are welcome to. I'll show you how I go through the homepage in Postman, and you can follow along with me to find the Postman Library API v2. So I'm going to shift into Postman and go to my homepage because that's where you would be if you just signed in. Up here, you have a search bar, and to find anything on Postman's network, you can use that search bar. In our case, we're going to look for the Postman Library API v2. So once you search for that, you get a lot of results. And the very first one has the exact same name, looks like it's maintained by Postman, and it's public. So this is official enough. It's probably where we have to go. There's also a workspace symbol letting me know that this is probably a public workspace. So if I select that, so I'm super zoomed in, which is why my layout might look a little bit different to you. Right away, you see one collection in this workspace called Postman Library API v2 docs. It's already selected since it's the first and only one in this workspace. Whenever a collection is selected, you can see a bunch of information pop up for it over here. One of those things would be the documentation for this collection. So this is telling you, it's basically a manual on how to use it and all of the background that you would need to know about it to be able to use it. However, as it exists right now in this workspace, I can't play around with it. So that doesn't really help us because we're trying to get our hands dirty. If you go over to the collection, there's a padlock symbol. And if you hover over that, you should see a message saying read only. That, of course, means that we can only see this information. We can't write, we can't change anything. So to fix this, let's hover over this collection and move on over to this More Actions menu. And what we're going to do is create a fork or a copy of this collection. It's called a fork, though, not just copy, because once we create a copy, it'll maintain an association with this original collection. So we're going to create a fork, and you can call your fork whatever you want to call it. Usually I just keep the default name there. And you're going to add this collection to a workspace that everyone has by default called My Workspace. It's a private workspace. You should all have that accessible to you. So you're going to fork it to My Workspace. And then if you want to get emails about this collection changing, you can feel free to do that. I usually don't want all that email, so I uncheck this box. And then you're going to fork this collection into My Workspace. Once you select fork, Postman's going to magically transport you into My Workspace, where you will now have a copy that you can interact with in a space that you have permissions in. So I'm not actually going to do this because I happen to already have a fork in that public workspace I showed you earlier. So I'm going to go there. However, you can go into My Workspace. I'm going to close this out so it's not distracting us. And here is actually my fork, my copy of that same collection. If I select it, it's all the same information. So I have all the same documentation. Looks like I have the same structure, the folder here within the collection, another folder, another request, and other requests, sorry. But before I start exploring that, let me read the documentation like any good developer would. And what it's doing is giving you some background. So basically, you are a librarian in this case. So as a librarian, sometimes you get folks who come to your library and donate books. So if they're donating books, you're adding to your database, you're adding more libraries that are accessible. Sometimes folks come to your library and they check out books. So you still have that book as part of your database, but you might have to change some information about that record of that book, right? Let's say it's checked out now and checked out needs to be true because someone just checked it out. If someone checked it out and they never returned the book and they actually lost the book and there's no way that book is ever coming back, then we might have to delete that book from our database. So we might have to make some delete requests there as a heads up. So essentially, you're a librarian managing this digital library. Here's some more information. Some books on their record have a field called "Is Permanent Collection Set to True?" That's just because we maintain this collection. We maintain all of the information on the server, and we've set some books ourselves as part of our permanent collection. This API also requires some authorization to make the post, patch, and delete requests. So note that you don't actually need authorization to make the GET request. You will need to set the API key in the collection variables, and here's that API key. You're going to want to copy that. I'm going to Command C, Postman rules there. And you're going to need it in order to make those requests. It's referring to these requests. So it told me I needed to add that API key to my collection variables, and it's not in my environment variables. So in this collection, if it's still highlighted, you should see some tabs that are related to that collection, and there's one called variables. If you go in there, there is a variable called API key. That is where you want to paste your API key. So I'm going to paste Postman rules here and save it. So in the More Actions menu of my collection, I'm going to save it. You might also have an icon that looks like save. I'm just super zoomed in, so I don't see it up here. So make sure you save that. And once you have that API key saved for your collection, you will now be able to use every request within this collection, except, well, you didn't need the authorization for the get books request, as the documentation stated here. But anyway, looking back at the request or the documentation, it's letting you know that this is a public API, so please be respectful and follow these rules. Only modify books that you've added yourself to the library. Understand that books in this API could be deleted at any time. And then some background on how this API is different from the original V1. So that's handy to reference for later on, or if you come across any bugs. So I'm going to exit out of that documentation. And let's actually just first start with seeing what's in the library. So let's go to this get books request within the collection. And I have request world up here and response world down here. Looks like I have some query parameters for this request. So I have the ability to see the genre checked out in search. Before I start messing with that, let me just send this request as is. So I'm at get books and I've sent this request, and here is a list of all of the books in the library. It looks like it's in JSON format. I see that over here. Here's a record of one book. Looks like this record has an ID, title, author, genre, the year it was published. Checked out is set to false for this one, so no one's checked this out yet. It is also not part of the permanent collection, and it was created at this time. Interesting. And it looks like every book has its own record with the same fields. They each have a unique ID and some other properties here. So interesting. Let's say I've taken a look at all the books in this library and I'm seeing one that's missing, one of my favorite books. So I'm going to donate that book to this library. I'm going to add a book to the server. So I'm going to do that through a post request, post add a book. So let's go over to post add a book. Now, because we're creating some new information on the server, the API is going to expect us to send a body. So in request world, let's tab over to body. Looks like we have a stub for you for a book that you can add to the library. However, this is not the book that I want to add to the library. I'm going to change this information, and you can update it and change it to whatever you want as well. You can add your favorite book. I'm going to add The Very Busy Spider. That one is by Eric Carle. The genre for that is fiction, although you can consider it self-help, maybe depending on your perspective. The year it was published, I think, was 1984. And yep, there we go. That's the book that I want to add. So I've adjusted my body to match the book that I want to add to the server. So I'm going to send this request. And in response world down here, you can see I got a 200 level status code, 201 specifically, letting me know that this was created. And then some other information that's really helpful. Here in my response body, I have the record of the book that I just created. Looks like a unique ID was automatically assigned to it because I didn't give it an ID in request world. I just gave it that information. Some of this other stuff was auto-populated. And that's by the developer's design, the developer who designed this API. So here's the stuff that I added. Looks like it's automatically checked out false, which means no one has checked this out yet. But I want to change that. I want to actually borrow this book now. So what I'm going to do is take the unique ID for this book, copy that. So make sure you're copying the ID of the book you just created. And what we're going to do is try to change checked out to true. We'll do that through a patch request, which is inside of this ID folder. This ID folder is letting you know that all of the requests within this folder have to do with changing just one book at a time, just one ID. So in that ID folder, there's a patch request. If I select that, please note that we're making a patch request because for the record of that book, we are changing just one field, just one part of that data, partial data. So when you change partial data, that's a patch request. If we wanted to change the entire record, all of those properties, that would be a put request. So up here in our patch request, we have a path parameter, which is holding the ID of the book. And we can update that ID down here under path variables for ID. You can go ahead and erase what's already in there and paste the ID of your book. So now that that has been added, because this is a patch request, we're changing some information. The API is going to ask, well, what is it that you want to change? I need to see that in a body. So in request world, we're also going to go over to body and make sure that this is exactly what we want to change for the record of that ID. We want to change checked out to be true now. And we've already done that for you as an example. So this stub could just remain the same. So we're changing checked out to be true. Let's send this request. And now in response world, our book has checked out set to true. That means we successfully borrowed it. And I see that in our success message over here. Awesome. So now that I've checked this out, let's say I'm a terrible steward of the library and I've actually lost this book. No one's able to borrow it ever again. It's gone forever. So I'm going to have to delete this book, unfortunately. So I'm going to grab that same exact ID, which should still be in your clipboard, hopefully. But in case it's not, you can copy it again. Take that ID and we will move over to the delete a book by ID request. So kind of a similar situation. We have to add the ID to a path parameter. So down here under path variables, change out that ID with the one for your book. Now, the API doesn't need to have a request body for this one because you're not updating or changing anything on the record for that book. We're just deleting it. We're removing it completely, right? So for this request, we can just send it with that ID and see if it deletes properly. So down here in response world, we have an interesting thing going on. We actually don't have a response body. That's okay because we were deleting something. We shouldn't see a response body, right? That record is gone, or it should be gone if we were successful. And it looks like we have a 200 level status code, which is telling us, yes, this was successful. You get 204 no content. The server successfully processed the request, but is not returning any content. That is good. That's what we hoped for with our delete request. Now, what if I tried to delete it again? It's already been deleted once. Can I delete it again? Let's see. I'll send this request once more. And this time, I have a status code of 404 not found, which means, and it also gave me a message that someone very helpfully designed. It says book with the ID, the one that I entered, not found. So that means I tried to do something. This is a client-side error. I tried to do something that's not possible. I tried to delete something that's not there. In this example, this is what we expected, but in the future, if you are seeing 400 level status codes, that means that that's on you. You might have something that you need to change or update or fix. So that's great. We just did CRUD, right? Create information, read information, update information, and delete information. So moving back into our presentation here. We sometimes get folks saying, okay, cool, I can do a lot of API stuff in Postman, but how do I get all of that into my project that I'm hosting on GitHub or GitLab? If you would like to use what you've been able to do in Postman in your own application's code, you could generate code for your requests in a couple of different languages to copy and paste right into your code editor like VS Code or into your terminal too. There's also integrations with your favorite Git repositories baked right into Postman, but we won't dive into that today. If you're curious about any of those cool features in Postman and how to use them, you can check out Postman's documentation in the Postman Learning Center. And there's a link for that and other resources in a slide at the end here. But looking at how you can generate code super quickly, let me exit out of all of these. I won't save them, but you can if you want to. I don't need to look at this anymore. In my collection for my Get Books request, which was the first one that we sent, it didn't need any authorization. If I hover all the way to the right where we had first seen documentation, underneath that, about 2 below, there's an icon that says code. If you select that, you can turn this request into code, which you can just copy wherever you need to have it copied. So in this first example, it's already set up in curl, so I can copy that curl command and I can open up my terminal to make the same request. I'm going to paste that curl command in there. And just like in Postman, I saw a list of all of the books. Curl is also showing me that same list of all of the books. I see To Kill a Mockingbird here. Now this is cool, but I don't like looking at walls of text. This is really hard to sift through to tell where one book starts and the other one ends. It's pretty tough. In Postman, it's a lot easier to see all the indentation and the color coding and all that. But if you are, married to curl, you can have that option for you as well. You can also choose to see it in JavaScript. So you can copy this and put it right into your project, and various other languages, which is pretty neat. Awesome. So let's recap what we just looked at. We got a background on API education and the Postman student programs. We took a look at what exactly an API is, and we saw an API behind the scenes. We talked about clients and servers and the request response pattern, and then we also dove into the anatomies of requests and responses. Plus, we got to try some stuff out. Here are some helpful general Postman resources. In your slide deck that should be shared with you later on, you should also have a link to our YouTube playlist with lots of fun API-related videos. Postman is a technology itself that comes with a manual, so of course it has its own documentation. The Learning Center or Postman docs are linked here for you, and you can find more information about how to maybe visualize the data that you get back in your responses, how to use mock servers if you don't have one set up, how to use the code generation feature that we just took a look at, how to start from scratch designing your API in the API builder. Lots of cool features in Postman that would take forever for me to look through, but that's all in the Learning Center for you to check out if you're ever curious. And then we also have the API network where you can find many more public APIs to explore. So Stripe might be there. OpenAI, like I mentioned earlier, is there if you wanted to play around with ChatGPT and stuff like that. The community forum here is where folks go to share what they're working on. So you can find information there about upcoming Postman events and stuff like that. If you want to check out the workspace that we use today, the link to that is available here on the slide for, as well. But again, it's public, so you can also just search for it. EducateHacks demo workspace. Cool. And then here's some information that you will find on our webpage for Postman student programs, plus your unique link to sign up for the expert training and badge. You'll need that for the challenge that we'll talk about in a second. But taking a quick look at the programs that we have, after you become a student expert through the free API training, you have a chance to become a student leader at Postman. This means that you can lead your own API events on your campus or through your clubs. You'll get priority sponsorship and a valuable experience leading a community, which you can show off on your resume if you want. You'll also get access to exclusive events at Postman and your own unique swag. We have student leaders all around the world who collaborate with each other and put on some amazing events. Our classroom program is for educators who would like to include an API curriculum in their coursework. We offer free elevated Postman plans for educators, plus monitoring tools to track their progress or track student progress. You can find more information about all of these programs on the webpage that you see linked here. And then here's our Discord community. We have over 10,000 people on our Discord server, including my team, who are all on there to help folks out. If you're looking for a community, you've got one with us, so please don't hesitate to reach us there. Our student experts and student leaders are all on the server as well to collaborate and share ideas. So it's a fun place to hang out and see what other folks are up to. Plus, if you're in there, you get first look at hackathons that we have sometimes exclusively only for our Discord community. And then here is what I know everyone's been waiting for. I have a challenge for you all, for the audience. If you succeed at this challenge, you will earn some free Postman swag. So on Twitter and LinkedIn, tag us in a new post in which you describe what you learned about APIs during this workshop. And then don't forget to add the student expert badge from your training. Remember that you have your own unique link to sign up for that free training. Once you have your badge and cool learnings to share, you can use the hashtag Postman Student and EducateHacks. Then if you want, you can tag me as the presenter so that it's easier for us to find your posts and your tweets. But just to emphasize further, winning posts will have details about what was learned during the workshop, plus an image of the expert badge that was earned. We've seen folks share images also of their handwritten notes, create Twitter threads with multiple learnings, so feel free to get creative with it. Your event organizers will be on the lookout for these posts, and they will be the ones to distribute Swag Store codes to the winners of this challenge. Those Swag Store codes can be used to select whatever items that you want from the Postman Swag Store. Cool. And then here is a feedback form for me to let me know how this workshop went, if any parts of it felt really fast, or if any parts of it were maybe too simple for you and you would have wanted to see something else. That's stuff I need to know so that for the next workshop going forward, I'm even better. Because the idea here is that you all are walking away with valuable learning. So please, please, please give me some feedback. And then here is, this is now Q&A. So if you have any questions, I'm going to check the chat, see if we have anything that we are wondering about. And then again, your unique link is up on the top. What does API mean? That's a great question. I wonder, because we covered it quite a bit, I wonder if there's anyone in the chat who can help out with that. What does API mean? That is something we did talk about. We will also give winners of this challenge a boost in judging. Ooh, nice. Could you talk about your experience with the coding bootcamp? It's okay that that's unrelated. So with the coding bootcamp, I actually attended General Assembly. That was right after my last year of teaching. And that was in 2020, so right when the pandemic hit as well. So fun time to make that change. But I did a 12-week program. We worked on the MERN stack. So we used React in that stack. We used Node, Express, and MongoDB. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. It was very challenging. I think finding a job after that was especially challenging given the time that we were in. But it was super valuable. I learned a lot. Yeah, I don't know if you had a very specific question about that experience, but in general, that's what it was like for me. So let's see if there's another question up here. What does ID stand for? So ID is just identification. So when we were looking at each of our books records, each book had an ID, which is just a set of numbers to identify that book. Where will the recording be posted? Kevin, Discord? Yes, a link. Oh, okay, I see Kevin answered that one. Cool. How to bring the first one down? I'm not sure what that question is referring to. So Maji, if you want to clarify, that'd be awesome. Oh, I think we're actually a little bit over time. Apologies to the organizers here. Let me actually stop sharing my screen. Cool. I don't know if Kevin or some of the other hackathon organizers here wanted to close out with any statements.
I think someone just had a quick question. What is the link to get the badge?
Yeah, let me actually throw that into the chat here so that I don't have to share my screen again. There we go. Oops, that's not the one. Apologies. It is bit.ly/educate-experts. Let me copy that again and send it to everyone. There we go. Awesome.
Okay, so yeah, so just as a closing thing, everyone who attended this, we would love it if you did the challenge and like posted about it on your Twitter. Obviously, there's swag to be given, but also during judging, if you are able to complete that before our live pitch session, we will give you a boost in judging. And also, I feel like integrating Postman and APIs into your project, we hope that you all are able to do that. And to answer Lisa A's question, we'll post it in the Discord. And yeah, that's kind of it.
Awesome.
We all hope you gain something from this.
Yeah, well, just to share some of my thoughts here, it was such a pleasure presenting for you all. You had some excellent questions. I love the participation in the chat. Yeah, let me know how I can continue to support you all if you need it. I'll share those codes with the organizing team so they're ready to go with those challenge winners.
Okay. And thank you for presenting and coming to our event.
Awesome. Yeah, would love to be back if you ever have another event.
Definitely.
Awesome. Have a wonderful weekend, hopefully, everyone. See y'all.
See you.
Thank you.
Okay, and to the participants still here, the next scheduled thing will be our